My name is Thomas Miller, and I once believed my life was neatly laid out in front of me like a well-ordered path through the woods illuminated by soft, golden sunlight. I had a steady job at a design firm in Seattle, an introverted but content personality, and a heart anchored by love for a woman I thought I knew better than anyone else. That woman was Hannah Parker, the girl who lit up every room she stepped into. She and I had dated for nearly 2 years before I gathered the courage to propose. Even then, my proposal felt like a leap of faith, both exhilarating and terrifying at once. But Hannah had a way of making everything seem possible, and so, on a brisk autumn evening, I took her on a weekend getaway to Redwood Shores, a seaside stretch a few hours' drive from home. The day I asked her to marry me, sunlight streamed through the tall redwoods nearby and the air carried the fresh scent of salt and pine. Standing on the sandy edge of the shore, I knelt with my heart pounding so loudly I could hardly hear the rustling waves. Hannah's joyous yes was swift and certain, and I remember thinking in that moment that life couldn't possibly be more perfect. We were married within a year of that trip. Our wedding was small, a modest ceremony under a simple white arch overlooking the same shoreline. Hannah was radiant in an ivory gown that fluttered in the ocean breeze. I had never felt prouder, never felt more sure that the person by my side was meant to share every sunrise and sunset with me. Our first few years together felt like a gentle waltz in a lamplit ballroom, unhurried, graceful, and safe. Hannah worked in event planning, a perfect fit for her outgoing nature. She was the type who thrived on excitement, long phone calls with friends, spontaneous parties, and after-work gatherings. I, on the other hand, was content to spend a Saturday night reading on the couch or experimenting in the kitchen with new recipes. Despite our differences, we found ways to meet in the middle. She accepted my quieter habits, and I allowed myself to step out of my comfort zone once in a while. That said, Hannah's circle of friends was massive. Most came from her college years in California, and many had relocated to Seattle around the same time she did, forming a tight-knit network. They'd host potlucks, barbecues, road trips to music festivals, always something that promised laughter and loud music. She invited me often. At first, I went along, determined to support her world the way she supported mine. But I always felt like an outsider, drifting on the fringe of their inside jokes and unstoppable chatter. Before long, Hannah noticed my discomfort. She teased me, saying, "Tom, you're too stiff, you need to loosen up." Or, "Come on, have a little fun." Eventually, though, she learned that no amount of persuasion could morph me into a social butterfly. I am who I am, quiet, reflective, more at ease in small, intimate settings. We had been married for about 5 years when the ground under my feet began to shift. It started innocently enough. Hannah's friend group planned a get-together at an apartment downtown. She didn't even bother trying to make me come. I gave her a distracted smile from behind my laptop as she slipped out the door. It was late when she returned, and I was still awake, reading on the couch. The moment she walked in, I noticed something different about her, a certain glow and electricity in her eyes I couldn't quite place. She launched into an excited tale about how an old friend of theirs, Jacob Palmer, had shown up unexpectedly. My ears perked at the name. Jacob? Why does that sound familiar? I asked. She explained Jacob had been part of her college circle, someone she hadn't seen in years because he'd moved to Europe for a job. He was charismatic and adventurous, always ready with amusing stories or bold life plans. Apparently, his overseas contract was up and he'd come back to the States to decide his next move. Hannah's voice trembled with excitement as she described Jacob's tales of foreign beaches, bustling cityscapes, and lively festivals. I felt a tinge of unease that caught me off guard. I was used to Hannah gushing over her friends, but there was something especially fervent about the way she talked about Jacob, something that unsettled me like a shadow crossing my line of sight. I made a snarky remark, something about how showy he must be, parading his global adventures to an enraptured crowd. Hannah glared at me. For the first time in a while, real tension crackled between us. She called it a night and walked off to our bedroom, her shoulders tense, leaving me alone in the living room with a stomach full of regret. The following week, Hannah seemed lost in thought. She'd stare at her phone, lost in silent reverie. I'd catch her smiling at messages only she could see. At dinner, she was physically present but mentally elsewhere. I told myself I was imagining things, that perhaps work was stressing her out or she was simply reminiscing about old college memories. But a heavy feeling kept gnawing at my insides. Then she started making excuses to go out. "I'm meeting the girls," or "I have extra tasks at the office." The frequency of these outings increased at a pace I couldn't ignore. Often, she wouldn't come home until late, slipping into bed long after I drifted off. I tried to ask about her day, about her friends, about her workload, but her answers were vague and hurried. I almost convinced myself that I was overreacting, that every couple goes through ups and downs, and maybe Hannah was just reconnecting with people now that life felt so routine. She was free to meet her friends as she pleased. I'd never been the type to tell her otherwise. Yet, the more my gut churned with suspicion, the more I realized I might already know the truth I didn't want to face. Fate intervened one evening when I decided to walk home from the design firm. It was a pleasant, crisp evening. Seattle's early autumn was just beginning to show, the leaves turning shades of gold and crimson. With my messenger bag slung over my shoulder, I wandered along the sidewalks, letting the cool breeze calm my anxious mind. I heard a voice call out, "Thomas." "Hey." Turning, I saw Mike Green, one of Hannah's longtime friends, who was stepping out of a small bookstore. He greeted me warmly. We exchanged the usual chit-chat about work, life, and the city's unpredictable weather. Then I casually mentioned that Hannah had been seeing all of you a lot lately, that she was always at some group hangout or another. Mike's confused expression was immediate. He furrowed his brow and asked, "What hangouts? We've barely met up since August." My heart sank. I felt as though the sidewalk had crumbled beneath me. When I pressed him, he said the last time the entire crew got together had been that night Jacob made his surprise return. Everyone had parted ways after, busy with their separate lives. So if Hannah had been busy with group gatherings, it was news to him. We parted shortly after, but I walked the rest of the way home with dread crawling up my spine. Hannah had mentioned another friend outing that very weekend. She spoke of it as though it were a normal plan, telling me she'd be out most of Saturday evening. With the seed of doubt now rooted firmly in my mind, I decided I needed concrete proof. I remembered that we'd installed a location-sharing app on our phones ages ago, mostly in case of emergencies. We never really used it, trusting each other's whereabouts. But that Saturday, as soon as Hannah left, I opened the app. My conscience flared up with guilt, spying on my wife? But a stronger instinct pushed me onward. If she was truly deceiving me, I had to see. Her tiny icon on the screen led me to an unfamiliar neighborhood in the northern part of the city, a place none of her usual friends lived. Anxiety churned in my stomach as I got into my car and followed the blinking dot. I found a rundown apartment complex, old brick structures with chipped paint and dimly lit hallways. I parked across the street, half hidden by an overgrown hedge, and settled in to wait. Minutes turned to nearly an hour. I remember resting my head on the steering wheel, hearing my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, Hannah emerged from a side entrance, glancing at her phone as if calling for a ride. She looked disheveled, her cheeks flushed, hair slightly tangled. My heart lurched. It was the exact confirmation I dreaded. I flicked on the headlights and pulled forward. She squinted at first, not recognizing me. Then a look of horror washed over her face when she realized it was our car. She approached, hesitated, then opened the passenger door. She stood there, half in the seat, half out. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Get in," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Hannah swallowed hard and slid into the passenger seat. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The engine idled, rumbling beneath the tension that thrummed in the air. Finally, I asked if she was going to keep lying. She tried to protest her innocence, but I wouldn't have it. My anger, my pain spilled out in ragged demands for honesty. She broke down, tears sliding down her cheeks, and admitted she was seeing Jacob. All those late nights at the office and friend gatherings had been secret rendezvous with him. I clenched the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Every cell in my body felt like it was on fire. I put the car in drive and tore off down the street. When she asked, panicked, where we were going, I answered with a grim voice that we were heading home to pack her things. I was done. The days that followed moved at a surreal pace. I filed for divorce. It felt like the only possible path. We argued about dividing our belongings, about who would keep the apartment or how to deal with shared bills. At times, Hannah cried, apologizing, saying she'd made a mistake. Other times, she grew cold, asserting her right to follow her heart wherever it led, even if that place was away from me. In the end, no apology or rationalization could soothe the wound she'd inflicted. I remember the day I finally moved out. I took my clothes, my computer, some cherished photographs of my parents. Everything else remained: half-empty bookshelves, stray utensils, and empty spaces in the closets. The emptiness in that apartment mirrored the hollowness I felt inside, as though both my living space and my soul had been stripped of color and warmth. Hannah didn't fight me on much. She was too enraptured by Jacob, I suppose. She spent most of her free moments with him once I was out of the picture. Initially, it infuriated me how easily she seemed to be letting go of our marriage. But soon, that anger gave way to a numb resignation. I reminded myself that she had made her choice, and I needed to make mine, to walk away and not look back. A few weeks after our separation became official, rumors reached me through mutual acquaintances. Jacob was preparing to move abroad again. Another opportunity had opened up for him, some new job in Europe. Hannah panicked, or so I heard, at the prospect of losing him so soon after leaving me. She begged him to take her along. But Jacob, ever the free spirit, apparently had no interest in dragging a brand new partner along on his next big leap. He certainly wasn't willing to fund her relocation costs. It wasn't long before Hannah found herself in a predicament of her own making: no marriage, no stable partner, and an apartment she could barely afford on her event planner's salary. The last time I caught wind of her situation, she had fallen into a deep melancholy. She buried herself in extra work, picking up events no one else wanted, anything to distract her from the loneliness that pressed on her like a vice each night. Meanwhile, Jacob slipped out of the country. Word spread that he was already seeing someone else in his new city. Whether that rumor was entirely true or half-truth, I can't say. But I do know it left Hannah heartbroken all over again. As for me, I found temporary refuge in a small studio apartment near my office. Gone was the spacious, shared living room with its plush sofa and array of photos from happier times. Instead, I had a single room crowded by boxes and a creaky bed I bought at a discount furniture store. It felt barren, but it was, at least, entirely my own. Nights were the worst. Sometimes I couldn't sleep, haunted by the memory of Hannah's laughter echoing through the halls of our old place, her bright voice that had once made me feel alive. During the day, I stayed late at work, throwing myself into new design projects, chasing deadlines that gave me no room for personal regrets. Coworkers probably noticed the shadow of sadness in my eyes, but if they did, they rarely said anything. I was grateful for that. In those quiet moments, I replayed the day I proposed at Redwood Shores, the warm sand under my knees, the sense of certainty and hope that flooded me as I gazed into Hannah's eyes. It felt like a scene from another life, as though it belonged to someone else. I often wondered if there were hints of our downfall, even then, small cracks that I'd chosen to ignore, blinded by love. Over time, I came to acknowledge that Hannah and I had always been different people. She thrived on spontaneity and attention, while I valued predictability and solitude. Our marriage might have been doomed from the start, though I believe it wasn't entirely hopeless. We genuinely cared about each other. Love was there, just not strong enough to withstand the lure of Jacob's excitement or the gap in our needs. Healing has been an unsteady road, punctuated by moments of anger, of grief, of longing for what might have been. Sometimes I caught myself wanting to call Hannah to say I understood. But I never did. The betrayal cut too deeply for me to mend that connection. Perhaps one day we'll stand on more even ground, two individuals who once shared a life, remembering the beautiful parts without the searing bitterness. Now, a handful of months after the final divorce papers were signed, I'm still learning how to be on my own again. I've started going to the gym, not so much to reinvent myself, but to keep my mind clear. I found a couple of friends among my colleagues, fellow designers, who invite me for coffee or the occasional movie. I'm grateful for that simple camaraderie. In the quiet of my new apartment, I've begun to see a different future forming. It's not the one I dreamed of when I first held Hannah's hand, but maybe it has its own quiet promise. Sometimes I take long drives out to Redwood Shores on the weekends, simply to walk along the coast. I'll pause at the spot where I proposed, letting the crash of the waves remind me that everything changes with time. The ocean never stops moving. Neither does life. I don't hate Hannah. I can't. Not entirely. Part of me will always cherish the early years we had, the playful moments that sparkled before reality frayed the edges of our bond. If anything, I hope she learns from this and finds a path that truly fulfills her. We both made mistakes, perhaps hers were more glaring, but I know love and relationships are rarely black and white. No matter how it ended, our story wasn't always defined by heartbreak. We were, at one point, two young dreamers who believed in forever. We had a quiet wedding, a cozy home, laughter shared over dinners, and gentle nights where our hands found each other under the covers. I hold those memories close, even if they feel like a distant echo. Life doesn't offer neat resolutions. Each day, I wake to a new dawn, unsure of what it may bring, but I've learned to cherish the potential for healing within it. My heart still carries scars. Trust does not regrow overnight, but I'm determined to keep walking forward. Maybe my story will serve as a cautionary tale for some, or a note of solace for others going through a similar storm. For me, it's simply the truth of how I lost a love I once considered unbreakable. I share it now because sometimes telling our stories is how we reclaim them. We take the fractured pieces of the past, hold them up to the light, and begin to see a different kind of beauty, one shaped by resilience, acceptance, and the fragile miracle of starting anew. And so, I stand here, ready to face each sunrise with a heart that's weathered pain but still beats with hope. Because even in the darkest hours of betrayal, I found that some part of me still believes in the possibility of tomorrow.